guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be the story of my daughter's birth. I have had a little cold, so if I'm like coughing or like clearing my throat or anything, that's all it is. Or if my voice sounds funny, I just still have some of that left. Yeah, so I had a lot of people tell me on like Facebook and on Instagram that they wanted me to share her birth story, and I was like, okay, I can do that. I wasn't sure if I was going to or not, just because things didn't go exactly as we planned on her birth. We had planned to do a home birth with her, so we had everything set up, we had everything ready to go, we were all set to have a home birth, but she decided that that's not what was gonna happen. So yeah, it was and is a interesting story. There was a lot going on all at once. Some of the details I probably won't share, just because there's certain things like that happened in the hospital that I don't really feel like need to be shared. Just certain things that happened like with the hospital and some of the staff and everything wasn't the best experience, so I'm gonna leave those parts out just because of how it all happened. But the majority of her birth story I'm going to share, and yeah, so let's get into her birth story. Okay, so her birth story starts out on September 17th. We had left, we were taking a trip down to Florida. My parents were already down there. They had left the 13th. They left, and so they got down there a lot earlier than we did. My husband and I both had work, so that's why we couldn't go down as early. So they were already down there. We were staying in a house together. Like, my parents had all of that set up, and they were just waiting for my husband and I and then one of my brothers to get down there, and they were just kind of chilling on the beach and stuff. So we left on Friday, September 17th at around, I want to say it was around 5:30 in the morning, 5:30, because we were like, okay, we're gonna try and do the whole trip in one day, so we need to wake up early just so that we don't get there that late, and there's plenty of time for like stops, so that we could like stop, get drinks, eat, walk around, just kind of not be in such a rush. So we left at the time that my husband, well, we didn't leave at this time, we woke up at the time that my husband normally wakes up for work, just because he was like, I'm already used to it, we'll do that and then, you know, just get on the road. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, and if you know you're tired, you can sleep in the car and stuff. I didn't end up sleeping in the car at all. So we left at like 5:30, and we got on the road and we started heading down to Florida. It was a pretty relaxing car ride most of the time. I mean, we got up, got in the car, because we had packed it all the night before, and we were just driving, kind of watching the sunrise and everything as we were going. So we go and we just kind of drive. We don't really stop. I think the first time we stopped on our way down there was to eat, which was a Subway in Illinois. I don't think we stopped before that, at least not that I can remember. Maybe once we stopped for gas before that, but I don't think so. So we get to Illinois, and I can't even remember the name of the town that we stopped in. It was super small. Like, from the highway, all you saw was the Subway, a McDonald's, I think a gas station, and then one other restaurant, and I don't remember what the other restaurant was. there was like the 3 restaurants and then a gas station. I think that's all you could see. There wasn't really anything else. And the road to get to the Subway, which we stopped at the Subway to eat, it was kind of a gravel road. Well, maybe it wasn't a gravel road, but it was a pretty torn up road that by that point was more like a gravel road. So we go and we park at the Subway, and I get out and I'm like, this is weird, like my butt's wet. And so I turn and well, it wasn't until I got out, so I like kind of leaned down because he hadn't gotten out of the car yet. And I look at my husband and I'm like, my butt's wet. And he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like my butt's wet. Like, I don't know if I was sweating really bad and like now my butt's wet, or like what happened. I'm like, but my butt's wet. So he gets out of the car and he like walks around and he looks at me from behind and he goes, babe, your butt's not wet, like it's soaked. And I'm like, what do you mean it's soaked? He's like, I mean, like, you're soaked. And I'm like, that's really weird. So then I look at the seat and the seat's completely soaked. And I look at him and he goes, I think your water broke. And I'm like, what do you, I don't think so. I'm like, how could it have broke? Because I didn't feel anything. Like, I didn't notice. It wasn't like a little gush or anything. Like, I literally did not notice at all that I was wet or that it broke. And he goes, well, you soaked the seat and the whole back of your pants is soaked, so I think your water broke. And so I'm like, no, in denial. Like, no, no. I'm like, no, I don't think so. I'm like, let's just go inside and eat. I'm like, I feel fine. And he's like, okay, whatever. So we go inside and I'm like, actually, I'm gonna go to the bathroom first and then, you know, order. And he's like, okay. So I go in and I go to the bathroom and I'm like, you know what, I want to call my mom. So as I'm sitting there in the bathroom, I call my mom in a Subway and I'm like, Ethan thinks my water just broke. And she's like, what do you mean? And I was like, he thinks my water broke while we were in the car because like the passenger seat is completely soaked and my butt's completely soaked, my pants are soaked. And she goes, well, did you feel anything? And I'm like, no, I didn't feel a gush. Like, I didn't notice that there was water leaking at all. Like, I literally did not notice. And she's like, well, sometimes it takes like a day before you actually like have the baby or really go into labor or anything. So are you guys still gonna try and like make it down here? Are you gonna stop? Like, what are you gonna do? And I'm like, well, if it can take up to a day, I'm like, we'll just head down there, you know, we'll be fine. We'll just make it down there today, and then like if I have her tomorrow, I have her tomorrow, if it was my water that broke, because I was still in denial. So I get done and I hang up with my mom, and we go and we order and we go and we sit back in the car, and I put a pad down on the seat because we had brought like our birthing kit with us just in case. So we brought that and it had all of our stuff in it. So I put one of the pads down on the seat and I'm like, I don't know, since it's completely soaked, like if it was my water that broke, maybe there's more, like I don't know, we're just gonna put it down to be safe. And I obviously changed my pants as well. And so we eat and then we get back on the road and we're driving for a while. And like I said, we probably stopped around 10:30. So we went from 5:30 and didn't stop until like 10:30. So then we get back on the road, and like I said, we were in Illinois, almost to Tennessee, I'm pretty sure. So we just keep driving and we're getting close to Nashville. We're probably like an hour out, an hour and a half out from Nashville, which Nashville's like the halfway point between our house and where we're staying in Florida. And I was like, okay, you know, we're almost halfway, we'll be fine, because I still felt fine. We ended up getting stuck in traffic for, I don't know, an hour, maybe 2. It was really, really bad because it had been raining super hard and it was so bad that my husband was like going slow on the highway, and he had his wipers on full, and people had their emergency flashers on. We were going super slow because nobody could see anything because it was raining so hard. So we're going, and there was probably 4 wrecks that caused all of the delay with the traffic and everything. And right as we got to the, I guess like the first wreck, like the traffic for the first wreck, I started having, you know, what I just thought were like cramping in my stomach, like Braxton Hicks, because I was still in denial that I was actually in labor or that I was going to be having her. So I started cramping, and I didn't say anything because it wasn't that bad. So I didn't say anything to my husband. And it just, as we sat in traffic, as time went on, it progressively got worse. So by the time it got really, really bad, we had probably, since it was like 2 hours probably that we were sitting in traffic, it was probably around 1 or 2 in the afternoon by this time. And we were dead stop traffic. Like, we weren't near an exit, nothing. It was just dead stop. And he could tell it, obviously it was getting bad, because it was to the point where it hurt so bad that I couldn't talk whenever the contraction started. And he was like, okay, we need to find somewhere to like pull over. I'm gonna call your mom. And I'm like, okay. So we finally get off at the next exit. We finally make it to the exit. We finally get off. And we're like, okay, now that we're like off the highway, the traffic shouldn't be that bad. We were wrong. There was so much traffic. Once we got off, it was just as bad as the highway. And people were driving super crazy. Like, we could have a green light and they'd have a red light and they'd still go and almost cause a wreck because they went on a red. Like, it was bad. We finally got to, it was right past a stoplight, honestly. There was like a little area to pull over. It was weird, I've never seen it before. But there's just like a little area where you could pull over. So he pulled over, and we were on the phone with my mom, and she was like, well, maybe like it's possible that it's because she's been sitting in the car for so long and she just needs to like walk around. And so we're like, okay. So since we were pulled over, I get out of the car and I start like moving around, like walking around. And as I'm like moving and walking, I start to feel better. And I'm like, okay, that's probably what it was, you know. It doesn't hurt as bad. Like, it's, as I'm walking, excuse me, as I'm walking around and everything, it's, the pain's getting less and less. So that's probably what it is. It's just me sitting in the car for hours and needing to walk around, because the only time we really stopped to walk around was whenever we stopped and got food. And we didn't really walk around that much. I walked in, I went into the bathroom, walked back out, we went through and we ordered. There was nobody in there whenever we got there. So we were right there, we went, ordered, and left. Didn't really walk around that much. So I was walking around and I was feeling better. And my mom's like, she also needs to drink a lot of water to help. And we were like, okay, because I didn't drink that much water either, because I was trying not to, so we didn't have to stop a lot for bathroom. And probably not a good idea either way. So we had bought some water, and I was just kind of drinking as much as I could of it. And my mom asked us if we were going to stop there and like get a hotel room so that way I could like walk around more, so that way it stopped hurting me, because she thought that was probably a good idea, or if we were going to continue since we were around halfway to Florida. And we decided that we were going to stop and get a hotel and stay there that night and then finish a little over halfway the next day. So we went and we got a hotel and we got up in the room and I was like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom really bad. So I went to the bathroom and I mean, it's probably TMI, but I was in there for like a long time. But it was weird because like as I like walked around the room and whenever we were pulled over and everything, it hurt less and less. But then whenever I like went to go to the bathroom, the pain got worse. So that caused me to be in the bathroom longer because the pain got really, really bad. It was probably around 4. I think it was around 4 by the time we actually got to the hotel that we decided to stay at and everything, just because of how bad traffic was and everything. So it was probably around 4. We get there and you know the pain's starting to get worse and worse. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try and lay on the bed. And I tried laying on the bed, like I got on my back and like tried laying on the bed, and it made it worse, honestly. Laying down on my back on the bed made it worse. So I'm like, no, I can't do this. I'm like, I have to get up. And he's like, okay. So like I get up, but I don't get up off the bed. I just like move over and like I'm on my hands and knees on the bed because I'm like, oh, this is kind of comfy. And he's like, okay, you know, whatever is comfortable, whatever, you know, helps the pain. And I was like, okay. So I'm kind of like on my hands and knees on the bed, just kind of rocking back and forth. And then I'm like, okay, I can't do this anymore, probably after like 5-10 minutes of being on the bed like that. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, the bed's just super wobbly. I don't like it. I want to move. And he's like, okay. So I ended up getting down on the floor, but still being on my hands and knees and just kind of like rocking back and forth on the floor. And I probably was there having contractions for a total of an hour, maybe a little more. So it could have been around 5 that we actually got to the hotel. I'm not entirely sure what time it was whenever we got to the hotel. But we were there and I was probably like in labor there at the hotel for an hour and a half, possibly 2 hours. I'm not really sure. So I'm like on the floor, on my hands and knees, rocking back and forth as contractions are coming. He's timing them all while it's happening because he's like, they're obviously contractions. We need to see like how far apart they are and everything. So he's timing them and they're not like super close together, but they're really intense whenever I'm having them. So he wasn't terribly concerned with like getting me to a hospital or anything at the time because he's like, they're not close together or anything. Well, they were, but they weren't. So we're still just kind of, I'm just kind of laboring in the hotel room because he's like, I'm not gonna take you to a hospital and then be like, oh well, she's not close enough or something, since this is both of our first child. We kind of knew what to do just because like I had been there because my mom had home births and she had them with me on down, so that's me and my 4 younger siblings. And we were just sitting there and kind of, you know, letting it all progress, doing what we knew we needed to do, breathing. I was doing the breathing. He was trying to help, but him telling me to breathe didn't really help me. I ended up getting like irritated every time he told me to breathe. So he kind of stopped telling me to breathe as like contractions were coming and stuff, but at the same time he was still trying to tell me to breathe. And he's like on the phone with my mom the whole time. And we were sitting there and I was laboring and I was laboring and I was laboring, and I finally get to the point where the floor like is too uncomfortable because like my knees start hurting and my arms start hurting, And he's like, okay. I was like, I need to move somewhere, but I don't know where because the bed's too uncomfortable. And he's like, okay, you know, like, what do you want to do? And they have those luggage things in the hotel rooms. I don't really know exactly how to explain it. It's like the metal with the, I don't even know what they are. The like elastic, the really like thick elastic that's like attached to the metal. And you can put your luggage on. And I ended up leaning over that and like holding on to the straps. And I was like, okay, now I feel like I need to push. And he's like, okay. So then I pushed, and probably about 3 or 4 times, and then he's like, I see feet. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, it's not her head that's coming out, I see her feet coming out. And he only saw 1 foot. So his face instantly went pale whenever he saw her foot. And he kind of starts freaking out, which the second I saw his face turn pale and he said that it was a foot, I started freaking out. And he tells my mom, because he's still on the phone with her, he goes, I see her foot. Her foot is coming out, and it's only 1. And she goes, okay, well, you need to make sure you stay calm, you know, don't freak Rachel out, don't stress her out. And he goes, kind of a little too late, because I told her that there was a foot, and now she's freaking out too. And so I just go, call 911. Like, call the ambulance. If it's her foot, we need to get to the hospital. He's like, okay. So he tells my mom that I wanted to call 911 and that he has to go so he can call him and everything. And she's like, okay, you know, just call me back whenever, you know, you can, and let me know what's going on. So he calls and he talks to the lady on dispatch and like tells her where we are and tells her what's going on, tells her that, you know, he's a EMT, and just kind of explains everything. And she goes, okay, so at least you know what you're doing. And, you know, she's sitting there talking to her as the ambulance and everybody's on their way. And she's like, okay, first responders are gonna get there first. And he's like, okay. And first responders get there, and I knock on the door. And my husband wasn't really thinking at the time because he just kind of yelled, come in. And then he goes, oh wait, they can't. I have to go open the door because it's locked. Obviously, it's a hotel room. So he gets up and he goes over and he opens the door, and they like prop the door open so that way they don't have to keep opening and closing it and everything. So first responders get there and they just stand in the doorway. They don't help, they don't do anything, they just stand in the doorway staring at me and him. And he's like, okay, whatever. And then the ambulance and the fire truck finally get there, and all of those people come up into the room, and everybody from the ambulance, you know, like they crowd around me, and they're like sitting on the floor and they're asking me questions like, what's my name, how old am I, when my due date was, and all this other stuff. So I'm telling them everything and like trying to answer their questions. And I think it was one of the guys from the ambulance. It may have been somebody from the fire truck. I'm not really sure where he was, but he was sitting next to me, and he looks at me and he goes, I'm gonna need you not to push. And I'm like, what? What do you mean don't push? So I look at him and I was like, well, I kind of have to, because like my body is gonna push whether I push or not. So I just kind of told him, well, I kind of have to. So he's just kind of like sitting there like trying to help me, and they finally get me moved from the luggage thing to whatever it is that they put me on. It was some kind of sheet. I'm not really sure what it is. I mean, my husband knows what it's called, but I'm not really sure. It's some kind of like sheet that they use to lift people up off the ground and put them like onto the bed. So they put me on that and they get me lifted up and on there, and we were on the 2nd floor of this hotel, and there's no elevator. So they have to get me from the 2nd floor down to the 1st floor, and they're like trying to keep me covered, but at the same time like they have to be able to see her So they're like trying to cover me up, but also not at the same time. And there's like people coming out of their rooms because they obviously heard the sirens and everything. So they're like looking at me, looking at the paramedic and everybody else. And we're trying to go down these stairs, and I'm still laboring. And so the fire chief is next to me as everybody from the ambulance is like pulling me downstairs and everything, dealing with me that way. And he's like, just breathe, you know, you're doing a good job. And I was like, okay. So I'm like breathing, and he's like helping me through it and everything, just talking to me, trying to like keep me calm. And we finally get to the ambulance, and they get me lifted up in it and everything. So I'm in there, and obviously my husband isn't allowed to ride with me just because of the situation. So I'm in the ambulance. There's probably 3 guys in there with me, and then the EMT, which she's driving. And they're trying to get me like hooked up to everything. The paramedic tries to get an IV going. If he doesn't get it going, he ends up blowing my vein. So he like put it in, pushed saline, and realized he blew my vein. So I'm not even paying attention to the paramedic. Like, I didn't even notice that he blew my vein until way later. He's freaking out. He's sweating and like can't really concentrate on what he's trying to do. And I've got one guy that's like watching to make sure that like she's okay, and he says that there's 2 feet that are out now. Like both of her feet are out, which whenever they're breech, we thought she had flipped, by the way. We didn't know that she was still breech because it felt like she had flipped and that she was head down. So he's like, okay, both feet are out, so that's good, because as long as both feet are out, I could still deliver her naturally, as long as both feet are out. Because if it was only 1 foot, it could have caused issues if her other foot got stuck or didn't come out, obviously. But both feet ended up coming out, so they're already out, like both of her feet are out. And he's like, well, it's a good sign that both of her feet are out, because that means that it's not going to be as complicated for her to come out. And I'm like, okay, good. And as we're driving to the hospital, the EMT, I don't know if she was new. I don't know what was going on with her. I don't know if she was just nervous. But she's like driving emergent, so she's going really fast. But she doesn't have the light. She has the lights on, but she doesn't have the sirens on. So obviously, like, that causes an issue because people don't hear her coming. They just kind of see her, so that causes an issue as we're trying to get there. It's taking a little longer and everything. And so the guy that's watching looks at another guy on the other side of me, which I don't really know what he was doing. But he looks at him and goes, you need to go up there and help her. She needs to get the sirens on, and she needs to get them on now. And he's like, okay. So he goes up there and he helps her and like gets the lights on and the sirens on and makes sure everything is good. And then he comes back and he's sitting there and he's telling me, you're doing a good job, you know, just keep breathing, you know, you got this. And we finally get to the hospital and they get me out and they wheel me into some ER room, which honestly was like the size of a closet. I thought I was in a closet. And there's like 50 billion people in this room with me, in this tiny little itty bitty room. And they're asking me all these questions. They're like, okay, what's your name? How old are you? Is anybody with you? When's her due date? This, that, and the other. And I'm like trying to answer them as I'm having contractions and still pushing and everything. So my husband finally gets there right before they take me out, and they say that they're going to take me into an OR and they're going to do a C-section. Even though by the time we got into the ER room, I could see half of her body out. So like, I could see her butt, I could see her legs, and I could see her feet. And they were saying that they were still gonna do a C-section and pull her out, like pull her back in and then out, which to me that seems crazy. Like, she's halfway out and you're going to pull her back in to pull her out again. But I didn't know that they were trying to do a C-section until after the fact, because they told my husband that they were still going to do a C-section since she was breech and it's her feet that are coming out, that are already out actually. So they wheel me into an OR and they didn't even get me onto the OR table. I was still on the bed and the doctor had to jump up on the bed. I think it's called a gurney. I'm not really sure. But she had to jump up on it to catch my daughter because she was out. Like, I did like 3 more pushes and she was like, she flew out. So they didn't end up doing a C-section. The doctor like barely got up on the table, caught her, they clamped her umbilical cord, cut it, took her. Like, it happened really fast. My husband wasn't even in the OR yet. She came that fast. Like, he was still trying to get a gown on and everything and she was out. So he gets in there and they tell him that she's out and take him over to her as they're like cleaning her up and everything, and they're still cleaning me up. And I'm not really sure what's going on. I just saw like my husband come in and I knew that she was out and everything and that he was over there with her. And then I'm just kind of like trying to relax because I'm like, I really just did that. Like, I had a baby. She was born at 7/16 on September 17th. And she was 4 pounds, 13 ounces, 16 3/4 inches long. So she was born and I was still getting cleaned up, and they finally moved me to the OR table just because the bed was a mess. And so they were like, well, we can't really have you on here right now. We need to get it like cleaned up and everything. So they moved me over to the OR table and I'm just kind of laying there, and they bring her back over and they lay her on my chest. And I'm just sitting there and I look down and I'm like, this is my daughter. Like, she's here. So I just kind of sit there and I stare at her for a minute. Oh, she's awake.